Day 546 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is a super quick update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So heading off, we'll start over taking a look at those Russian losses once again, as Russia currently sits on more than 258,000 military personnel losses, which represents an additional 480 in the past 24 hours. Then as for hardware losses, so 11 tanks, 12 APVs, and 23 artillery. And so far, the double-digit losses for Russian tanks continues into the new day. Although it's not really surprising, given the recent Ukrainian land liberations I'll mention shortly below. Then we'll head over to the map as the Russian MOD reported that it intercepted 3 drones over Moscow during the early hours of the morning, which therefore closed down the airports and left a bunch of planes in a hold-in pattern outside of the city. And I was just talking about this a few days ago, as it's just such an untenable situation for Russia and Moscow, and even most western regions of Russia, to cope with the rebounding after effect of the initial invasion, where the karmic effects are now swinging back to themselves, making it more and more difficult for Russians to continue to live in this little make-believe world of theirs, in which they think their invasion isn't affecting them. Then we'll head over to the Ukrainian map today and start out in the Donbass as Russian forces continue to frantically attack Klishchivka, which is just south of Bakhmut. But they also continue to have huge problems, and that is the Ukrainian positions overlooking the village, from which any movement can be monitored, and for which Russian troops can be effectively repelled, which, by the way, happens on a daily basis. Then we'll head across to the southern axis today as Ukrainian soldiers of the 47th Brigade fought their way into Robotyne and liberated some locals. There was also some gestures of goodwill from the Russian army as they fled the scene, forgetting tanks and various other vehicles. Then, Ukrainian precision artillery hit and destroyed a large command post south of Tokmak. There was even some reports that the FSB, which is the Russian Federal Security Service and the successor to the KGB, that had to leave Tokmak and decided to pull all the way back to Crimea. And then speaking of Crimea, also not safe, and even less so now, as Ukrainian military intelligence claimed the destruction of an S-400 air defense system on the most western edge of occupied Crimea near Olenivka. And what a sight to behold that one was. So far, it's already been stated that the entire S-400 battery was destroyed, which is no easy feat normally, given that you're typically dealing with the inclusion of a command vehicle, a radar vehicle, and at least 2 launcher vehicles for the complex, which are spaced at a bare minimum distance of a few hundred meters apart to avoid being destroyed in a single strike. But it's possible that this one may have just arrived and had not yet been set up. Not to mention, this footage is from a Ukrainian drone hovering just above Russia's most advanced air defense system ever built, supposedly. So potentially, Ukraine took advantage of this lucky moment when they had the chance. And then, since we're still in the region, I'll mention that Russia is now taking to sinking ferries around the Kerch bridge to protect against Ukrainian autonomous naval threats. So apparently about 6 ferries in total will be used to block future naval drones, but something tells me they'd need a lot more ferries than that to protect the bridge. And it's funny because we often think of the Kerch Bridge as mostly spanning the arch design we often see in photos, but that only represents a mere 220 meters out of a whopping 19 kilometers or about 12 miles for the entire length of the bridge. It's also believed that the Kremlin demanded anything to secure the bridge, which is critically important for the military logistics of the Russian army's occupation. And I actually believe Putin's fate is inextricably linked to this very bridge. You see, in Russia losing the bridge, they lose their ability to hold and defend Crimea, a location that they've held since 2014. And when Russia loses Crimea to a Ukrainian liberation, it would be such a blowing defeat to Russian morale, in the very least, causing a massive waning of support for the top dog. Then heading across to a few news updates for the day. So the Ukrainian company named Ukrainian Armored Vehicles has established joint production of the 120mm mortar munitions in Ukraine with two undisclosed NATO member countries simultaneously, probably Poland and Slovakia. So the 120mm sized shells are of Soviet heritage. And the AFU had mentioned in the past that they were dealing with an acute shortage of these some time ago. But the passage of time can be a beautiful thing, my friends, as we see more and more how the Ukrainian army has been gearing up in a multitude of ways. Then in some other news, General Armageddon has been fired. That's right. General Sorovikin has been relieved of duty. So nearly 2 months ago, he was detained by the Russian government due to his suspected involvement in Prigozhin's half-completed or aborted mutiny of Moscow from about 2 months ago on the June the 24th. So first he was detained, then someone from the State Duma said he was resting. Now he's been relieved of duty, and further than that, a source from the Russian media group, the RBK, just reported that the Russian MOD confirmed he is currently on a short vacation, which is really just such mafia language. I shouldn't be surprised about it, but it just makes me laugh. Then in some other news, the Lithuanian, Portuguese and Finnish heads of state have all arrived in Kyiv in the last day as they showed support and solidarity for Ukraine. You see, many heads of state have visited and continue to visit Kyiv all of the time. And add to that, Zelensky travels abroad a lot to meet with international leaders, which leads me to my next news piece. Because Bunker Boy, my apologies, Russian President Vladimir Putin was really nowhere to be seen at the latest BRICS summit held in South Africa today, where he instead had Foreign Minister Lavrov take his place. And as a recap, BRICS is a consortium of nations including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all developing nations, by the way, that would hope to create their own globally dominant currency, which is a massive pipe dream, by the way, almost impossible to implement, as the member nations can't even align on common values with their vast political differences. Even two of the biggest members, China and India, can't even get along with their never-ending border clashes. But more than that, the BRICS nations, they would like to show a very united front for a chance to strip away at the West's hegemony. But the problem with having a BRICS summit here is that South Africa is also a signatory of the Rome Statute of the ICC, meaning that if Putin entered the country, South Africa may have been compelled to enforce the ICC's arrest warrant that is out for Putin because of all those war crimes. Instead, Putin had to phone it in, and it was just weird because the picture was clear, but his voice sounded really different and robotic, and not Putin's voice. I'll reserve my comments on that situation, but I'm sure a few of you will want to chime in with some funny reasons in the comments below. Then we'll move across to just a super quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. So late night Russian state media TV is at it again, this time with Russia's top propagandist, Solovyov, pulling out the nuclear card threat once again, this time in response to all of the recent F-16 news updates. But as he waffles on, it's really hard to understand his logic. First he is worried about the F-16s, then he says the West and America's F-16s don't pose a threat because Russian military might is far more advanced than anybody else. He also said the following, which was that maybe we should just rebuild all of it from scratch, as he refers to nuking Ukraine and starting all over again. I mean, apart from the cesium-137 in the soil for a couple of thousand years, but at what point do you take a step back after making these types of mass annihilation comments, then ask yourself, hey, maybe I'm the bad guy? But the best part was about 10 minutes in, when one panelist asked the sobering question, asking, why are we always pulling out the nuclear threats? Is our army unable to win a conventional battle? Causing Solovyov to just tap out to such a reasonable question and go into some kind of a mental gymnastic fit. And probably the weirdest part of this video was the fact that there was a high-level Russian Orthodox priest on the panel that was extremely quiet. And he never really thought to barge in and say, hey, you know what, guys? This conversation has completely devolved outside of the accepted norms of Russian Orthodoxy. You're all a bunch of sociopaths. So that'll be it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Slightly shorter video today, but yeah, appreciate all of your support, your comments, your likes, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.